I'm Kathy Maxwell.
I'm Nathan Maxwell,
And welcome to the Good Faith Bible Study Podcast,
where we'll offer a few additional insights about the Bible study lessons from Good Faith Magazine.
Get the magazine and learn more at goodfaithmedia.org.
This lesson, The Garden, is for January 12, 2025, and the focal passage is Genesis 2:4 through 25. Okay, so first, we want to recommend a couple of additional resources on Genesis. If you listened to our last lesson podcast, The Heavens and the Earth, for January 5th, you may recall the two authors we introduced then, Tremper Longman III and John Walden. As it turns out, both authors have managed to occupy the recommendations for this week as well. Between the two of them, these biblical interpreters have penned a small library on Genesis, enough to keep a Bible study occupied for a few years anyway. Last week, we mentioned John Walton's Lost World of Genesis 1. Despite being the first volume published in the series and focused on the first chapter of the Bible, strictly speaking, it's the second book in the series. The first, by series order anyway, is The Lost World of Adam and Eve, Genesis 2 through 3, and the Human Origins Debate. Another unexpected detail is that despite referencing Genesis 2 through 3 in the title, the book engages Genesis 1 in some important ways. The whole book is arranged into a series of propositions, all focused on recalibrating the reader's perception of the early chapters in Genesis, so that we can best hear how they might have resonated within the context of the ancient Near Eastern world. In any case, if you're intending to read the whole Lost World series, an endeavor well worth the effort, then The Lost World of Adam and Eve really is the best place to start, followed by The Lost World of Genesis 1. One more thing worth mentioning, The Lost World of Adam and Eve also includes a cameo of sorts from N.T. Wright, an excellent New Testament scholar who unpacks Paul's use of the word Adam, the Hebrew word for man or humankind. The second resource we want to mention belongs to a particular class of Bible study tools called a commentary. Bible commentaries come in all shapes and sizes, from the widely popular and readable, intended for personal devotion, to extremely technical works that make academics spontaneously emit heart emojis. However dramatic this range may be, all commentaries do essentially the same thing: guide readers through a book or major section of the Bible, explaining the text along the way. One such example is Tremper Longman's commentary on Genesis, which belongs to the Story of God commentary series on the whole Bible. The Story of God commentary series is pretty well designed and suitable for any sort of teaching or preaching on Genesis. If you've got any sort of inclination for a serious dive into Genesis, you're going to want a commentary on hand. There are actually quite a few really superb commentaries on Genesis, but Longman's is as good a place as any to start. Alright, so this week's lesson has a pretty specific focus. The passage is Genesis 2:4 through 25, but the central concern is the relationship between the two creation accounts in Genesis 1 and 2, and their composite portrait of God. In a nutshell, it's not so much what happens, but who we meet: the transcendent, immanent Creator God. As we noted in the lesson, it's hard to overstate how essential these two divine character traits actually are. Together, and in a way counterbalancing each other, they pave the way through Scripture, all the way to the cross. This approach is concerned almost exclusively with the role creation plays internally, within the story of Scripture itself. Crucial as that may be, well, it still leaves a lot of creation story stones unturned. We might also look outward and consider how Genesis' take on creation might have sounded to its original ancient audience. And that leads us to a question you may not have ever thought to ask. Is the Genesis account of creation unique within its ancient Near Eastern context? Well, as it turns out, no, not exactly. It may be surprising to hear that origin stories were a thing in the ancient world, but it makes sense if you think about it. A thriving human community needs a shared sense of identity, and an account of how that community came to be goes a long way toward building that identity. That is, of course, one reason why the biblical story of creation is so important to us. So when we compare Genesis 1 and 2 with other creation stories from the ancient world, we do notice some similarities. Genesis is most frequently compared with the Enuma Elish, a Babylonian epic dating back to the 2nd millennium. Both Genesis and the Enuma Elish include a watery chaos covered by darkness that precedes creation. The chaos in each account is tamed by a powerful deity, and both exhibit a loosely similar order of creation. The similarity that stands out most to me, however, is that in each account, the Creator rests once the work of creation is complete. Striking as they are, these similarities are also easy to overstate. As a graduate student, one of my assignments was to clobber my way through a partial and heavily assisted reading of the Enuma Elish. I'm still waiting to hear from the Pulitzer Committee on my translation, but I was so surprised to discover how the biblical and Babylonian accounts could be so similar in fact, and yet, at the same time, so different in character. Compared in this way, Genesis stands out as a unique voice in the ancient conversation about human beginnings. The biblical account seems to address, in an intentional, direct way, the common beliefs of the day. Rather than a pantheon of deities reacting, poorly one could argue, to creation and each other, Genesis presents one God, totally separate from and sovereign over creation. The sun, moon, and stars aren't objects of worship because they were made by God and entirely subject to God's control, just like everything else. Likewise, the earth should not be divinized for its fertility, since that too was a consequence of God's creative order. But the starkest contrast is found in the creation of humans. In the Enuma Elish, humans originate in the aftermath of a war among the gods, a conflict that begins with younger gods making a ruckus to the irritation of a senior god. Marduk, the battle's victor, forms humans from the remains of defeated deities. Rather than an unintentional or even undesirable byproduct of creation, Genesis, by contrast, portrays the creation of humans as intentional and very good. Despite its distinctive character, some have regarded the Genesis creation account as little more than an appropriation of Babylonian mythology. But what makes Genesis so compelling, so arresting, is that it composes a truly new song from an old, familiar tune. Rather than recycled myth, Genesis reads more like a quantum leap in theological thinking. And that's really the thing we want to put our finger on here. There's a takeaway not only in what Genesis reveals about the character of God, but also in the way it formulates that revelation. It's as if the storyteller begins by saying, "Hey, you know the story of how we all came to be, right?" To which the ancient audience collectively nods. Of course we do. Everybody does. And from that common ground, the storyteller advances. So here's our origin story as it was meant to be told. The truth about you and the God who made you. Turns out you're not the afterthought of an aspiring juvenile deity. You're more like the crown jewel, an appointed caretaker of a creation forged by the one true God. It's not unlike the Apostle Paul's deliberation on the unknown God at the Areopagus in Acts 17. Both set an example for communicating the narrative of Christian faith to the world.
This podcast is produced by Good Faith Media. Learn more at goodfaithmedia.org.
There, you can find a wealth of additional resources, including the 12-volume Nurturing Faith commentary by longtime lesson writer Tony Cartledge.
It covers every text for every Sunday in the 3-year cycle of the Revised Common Lectionary.
Our podcast music comes from Pond 5. Check out the show notes for more information,
including a transcript and a few other tips for studying Scripture.